Hi friends, Tracy here to tell you that making a podcast is hard work. There's research, scripts, editing, and all of that can mean a million decisions. Fortunately for me, my choice in a podcast hosting platform was easy because I decided upon Anchor by Spotify. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your podcast today. Welcome to Crescent City Crime, dear listeners. I'm Tracy.
And I'm Brian.
And of course, as always, thank you to everybody who has been listening to us and for making us a part of your lives. We really appreciate that you set aside some time for us.
Yes, thank you very much. You are wonderful people, especially wonderful because you have this type of interest and you're pursuing it.
Yes. And of course, we want to encourage everybody to tell a friend about us. Word of mouth is always the best thing. And please, if you could find it in your hearts to leave us a review on your preferred podcasting platform, that's always helpful to our show.
Yes, thank you very much. It helps. It helps us a lot, and we appreciate everything you do for us.
And of course, thank you as always to Lucy, who helps me run the TikTok.
Thank you, Lucy.
And you know what? Before we get into today's episode, Brian, we recently had a legal battle with our district attorney out here in New Orleans.
Yes.
Now, it is kind of a long story. It's not the topic of today's episode, but the district attorney of Orleans Parish was found not guilty in federal court for tax evasion.
That is correct, and we have an interesting anecdote to that story as it was the talk of the town today. This is the kind of thing that ends up happening on a television show or a movie, okay? His defense team asked him to join their law firm, and he is going to be in charge of civil litigation for a local law firm in addition to being district attorney of Orleans Parish. Now, this is out of the ordinary for a metropolitan city, because this is the kind of thing that normally happens in a very small town where the district attorney doesn't have very much to do.
Right.
And so he has the time to also pursue a private legal practice, just the same as, let's say, a state legislator, which is actually a part-time job, as the legislature is not always in session in any given state. The legislators, they all have regular jobs that they do. Many of them are attorneys. But this is a different situation. District attorney is a full-time job, especially in a metropolitan city. And my take on this is I can't help but think that he knows he's in over his head as district attorney. He knows he can't handle the job. And he's decided he's going to take this offer now as part of his exit strategy.
Right.
Because he knows that this is a bird in the hand.
And he's probably going to be voted out.
I wouldn't doubt it. He's practically everyone's turned on him, including his supporters.
Well, I don't hate him. He was not my preferred choice for district attorney, but I don't hate Jason Williams. So
no, I don't either. And I love rooting for the underdog, and I did have high hopes after his trial that he would 100% focus upon his office and turn things around, roll his sleeves up, and get serious now that he's got this tremendous monkey off his back.
Right.
But it's not exactly appearing to be the case. And, I mean, of course, we hope we're wrong. Everybody hopes they're wrong and that he will turn this around and that he'll do an amazing job as district attorney in addition to this other
law firm offer, litigation offer.
Right.
civil litigation.
Yeah, that's not the only thing he's overseeing at that law firm either. Um, I just, it's terrible optics, and he hasn't said anything to address it to the press.
And he doesn't really have to either. Let's be frank. He doesn't really have to. And the reason why I brought this up, though, is mainly because when you're prosecuted by the feds generally, you're screwed. But somehow, some way, Jason Williams was in that like 2% of cases that the feds were not able to make.
Well, and of those cases, more people are able to successfully defend against tax fraud,
right,
against the federal government, because of the complexity of the federal tax code makes it easier to defend this than to prosecute it. Because I guarantee you, you're not going to get a jury of 12 that is, even after they've received their instructions, are going to be able to comprehend the federal tax code. There are many tax attorneys who can't fully wrap their heads around it either. In fact, they say nobody can. So that's the biggest reason why he was able to get acquitted, is the complexity of the federal tax code.
Right. And again, this is going to be a whole different topic on a whole different episode on a different day. But today's episode is a bookend to last week's episode. In last week's episode, we talked about 3 teenage boys whose remains were found scattered in remote areas outside of New Orleans in 1978 and 1979. All 3 were physically similar in appearance, and all 3 worked at Jimmy's Coney Island hot dog stand in the French Quarter. Their bodies were found hogtied, and they were all murdered in the same manner. But after that, going forward to 1982, a body was pulled out of the Mississippi River at Piety and Desire Streets in the 9th Ward. The body was that of a young gay man whose name was Eddie Wells. Detective Stanley Burkhart, who joined the NOPD in 1972, is credited with starting the sex crimes unit within the NOPD. He initially investigated Eddie's death and insisted that Wells had been hogtied and thrown into the water. While Burkhart kept insisting that Eddie had been murdered, his cause of death is still listed as an accidental drowning. Whether someone punched him in the face and kicked him in the water, we just couldn't tell, because his face was too disfigured because of decomposition, the coroner said. He estimated that the teenager's body had been floating in the river for 4 days. There was no evidence of skull fracture, gunshot wounds, stab wounds, or suffocation. So the coroner, Frank Minyard, okay, so you've obviously heard that name before, concluded that the cause of death was asphyxia due to drowning. However, Burkhart would not let it go that Eddie had been murdered. He still believed that he had been murdered, and he pointed to a phone call received by the victim's mother shortly after Eddie had disappeared, in which an anonymous man informed her that she'll never see your son alive again. Burkhart also pointed out that Eddie maintained a dangerous lifestyle by hustling older men for money, but remember that hustler is just another term for somebody who was sex trafficked. Eddie's wallet and his client notebook was also missing, even though Burkhart knew that Eddie kept these things on him at all times. Now, Brian, why do you think this police officer was so insistent that Eddie was murdered? And why do you think he would know that Eddie always had his client notebook on him at all times? I mean, while it's not such an unusual thing for somebody to have on them at all times, but to know a very personal detail like a client notebook was always on this person at all times. Why would somebody know that?
Well, for a detective, this is a no-brainer. Okay. Burkhart already knew he was involved in criminal activity.
Right.
You see? And someone who is involved in criminal activity mysteriously dies. I would say 99.9% of the time it's a murder.
Right.
Yeah, that obviously makes it a murder, because when you're involved in criminal activity, there's someone always has a reason to kill you if you're involved in criminal activity.
That's quite true. Now, Eddie came from a single parent home. He lived with his mother and two brothers. He was a drug addict and he did not attend school. He had been sexually victimized by adults since he was young. And in the years since Eddie's death, his mother and brothers have also passed away. So there's nobody with a biological tie to Eddie to advocate for him any longer. And even though his death is still classified as an accidental drowning, a new inquiry was started in 2018, and a cold case detective has been assigned to investigate Eddie's death. Another piece of this puzzle is a man named Richard Winman. When Richard was a young boy, he was recruited into the Boy Scout Troop 137 when they canvassed the neighborhood he lived in. Unfortunately, during his time in the Boy Scouts, he was molested by the assistant scoutmaster, Harry Kramer, and several other adults. In 1977, it had become publicly known that Boy Scout Troop 137 was a pedophile ring.
Which these days, in retrospect, what we've come to find out about the Boy Scouts, unfortunately, is that the organization was sought out by very unscrupulous sexual predators.
And it's not just the Boy Scouts, right? I mean, we've seen this within the Catholic Church. We saw it with the Penn State scandal.
We've seen it with Baptist churches too.
So
yeah.
So a lot of organizations have been exposed to have this sort of thing going on.
Yes, organizations that allow adults who are considered to be role models to get exposed to young children.
Right.
To spend time with young children. Yes, it turns out that society has found out that sexual predators joined those organizations with a plan to
be the cool adult and attract these kids and
inflict their sick pleasures
right
upon innocent children.
Now, when Richard was only 12, he testified against Harry Kramer, and Kramer was convicted on 26 counts of molestation. The New Orleans Police Department assigned Stanley Burkhart to protect young Richard when he was testifying against Harry Kramer. And like the boys we discussed in our previous episode, Richard Winman also worked at Jimmy's Coney Island hot dog stand. Richard Winman would go on to accuse Stanley Burkhart of taking him into the NOPD's evidence room, showing him child pornography, then sexually abusing him, and the abuse would last for the next few years. Richard also said that when Burkhart victimized him, he would show him a photo of Eddie's dead body and ask Richard if he wanted to end up like Eddie.
So there was a secret motive for Burkhart, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
Of course. While Burkhart was still an officer, he was fired from the department and sent to prison after he was convicted for mailing explicit images of underage boys to undercover police officers. He was also charged and found guilty of raping a 9-year-old relative and possession of child pornography. And he was sent to jail in 1987, but what do you know? He was eventually paroled.
And so Burkhart turned out to be just another one of those sick, sexual, perverted predators.
Right.
Who decided to join an organization so he could gain power over young people.
Right. And if I had to guess, he was probably in the district, a detective in the French Quarter district, and he probably knew that that hot dog stand was hiring young boys. And of course, if you hire young people to work at a place, other young people who know them are going to come around, right? So
Yes.
this sounds like it might have been a hunting ground for him.
Yeah. Yes.
In 2019, Richard Windman filed a lawsuit against the city of New Orleans and the New Orleans Police Department because he believes that they failed to protect him from Burkhart. The suit also states that Burkhart took Richard Windman to pedophile parties in the French Quarter and would use him as bait to make cases against other pedophiles. Now, isn't that kind of illegal if you're using an underage kid to do such things? Or at least, very least, unethical, or you would have to clear this with a supervisor, right?
No, I don't. I don't believe law enforcement's allowed to use underaged people.
Okay.
For that type of law enforcement activity.
Right.
Now, I believe the only law enforcement activity I can think of that you could use a teenager for is someone who's working with state police or ATC, alcohol tobacco control.
Right,
okay.
Right.
To attempt to buy cigarettes or alcohol
from a store
without ID.
Right.
Okay. You see, I believe that's the only instance where that can be done.
I see.
Okay. And you have to have, you have to have parental permission.
Right.
And so somehow I don't think Burkhart had parental permission here, and he wouldn't have been allowed by the department to do that.
Right. I didn't think
historically, that's not how the NOPD has pursued that kind of thing.
Right. Now, the lawsuit also said that when Richard reported the abuse to the NOPD, his report was not taken and officers refused to talk to him. Now, Richard Windman is not alone in standing up to Burkhart. Another man named Vic Groomer also publicly accused Burkhart of abusing him. And he told his entire story to one of our local news affiliates. I mean, for the area. They're not affiliated with us in any way. But it was Fox 8 News, and he first met Burkhart.
The ABC affiliate.
Yeah, it is an ABC affiliate, but we are not affiliated with ABC. He first met Burkhart when he moved into the Bayou St. John apartment complex that his parents managed. And he told Fox 8 News that Stanley Burkhart was one of the police officers that lived in the building. He also said that the inside of Burkhart's apartment, that he would stay inside of Burkhart's apartment while he played with his nephews who visited often. And he said that Burkhart was friendly and kind to him until one day he went over there and the nephews were no longer there. And that is when the abuse of Vic Groomer started, and he was only 8 years old. He said that Burkhart would point guns at him just to terrorize him.
Okay, yeah, that's it's pretty inappropriate. As a teenager, as a young boy, no, never had a gun pointed at me. Then, I remember, I think I was like 5 years old when my father showed me his surplus Walther P1, a variant of P38, and his Walther PPK, both unloaded, and educated me on what they are, satisfied my curiosity, and told me if I ever wanted to see them, all I had to do was ask. But that was the closest thing, and after that, my curiosity on firearms was actually satisfied, and I just wanted water guns and toy guns because I knew I could play with them. But that's another, kind of another subject matter.
It is, and unfortunately, this was not your situation, right?
No,
not
he
was
all.
Not like unloading the gun and being like, "Hey, kid, do you want to are you curious about my firearm? Do you want to, when you get old enough, maybe I'll take you to the shooting range and let you practice with it." This was not that at all. This was an act of terror.
Exactly. Very inappropriate, very, very abusive. And Of course, that wasn't the only psychological abuse he was subjected to.
Right. And authorities have never booked Stanley Burkhart on the accusations brought forth by Vic Groomer or Richard Windman. But Richard Windman says that he is especially grateful to the Louisiana State Police for keeping Burkhart under a microscope. And he says that there's a lot of people that have been watching Mr. Burkhart, and I'm determined that there are a lot of other people that this isn't going to happen to again. So right now that there's a lot of interest swirling around Burkhart and what he has done in the past, and he also says that, or Vic Groomer says that he called Burkhart an animal and a monster, and he said that that's the best thing that he could say about him. And he says that it just makes him resolve to be a part of helping other people come to tell their story, because I know that there are more people out there that he hurt. I know there's no doubt in my mind that there's more kids out there. And right now we are going to stop here and take a break to hear from our sponsor, and we will be right back. So, authorities believe Burkhart to be so dangerous that they wanted to keep him behind bars for life. To achieve this, they used laws specifically designed for those who are said to be sexually dangerous. A federal judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Burkhart to life in prison in 2011. However, Brian, guess what?
What?
After only 4 years of treatment, a different judge set him free, but under supervision. What is your take on that?
That's when you have a good attorney. It may have also been an attorney who contributed to the judge's campaign fund, which happens quite a bit in New Orleans, or could even be
anywhere else on a golf course.
Well, well, yeah. Well, it could even be because the bail bondsman is a political supporter of that judge.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, that happens quite a bit down here.
Right. Well, as recently as July the 1st, 2019, Stanley Burkhart was arrested by the Louisiana State Police when he failed to register as a sex offender in Louisiana. So how do you like that? Investigators discovered that Burkhart was using a photo sharing site under a persona that he did not report to law enforcement, which is a condition of being a sex offender. He also added over 100 photos of young boys to his favorite photos and left suggestive comments on them. He can't help himself, can he?
That's typical behavior. These sick individuals tend to reveal themselves one way or another.
Yeah, they do.
Maybe not overtly to their neighbors, but somewhere they betray who they are, because they, like you said, they can't help themselves. And because they can't help themselves, yeah, these are the kinds of people who should be locked up. Right. Lock them up and throw away the key.
Right.
Because these people were the way they were before they joined the organizations that gave them the power they needed to ply their sick pleasures.
Yeah, I really don't believe it when certain doctors say that they believe they can fix pedophilia. I really don't think you can.
No, any doctor who says that, I think, is simply trying to promote themselves.
Yeah, you're probably right.
That's shameless self-promotion, which is kind of disgusting.
Right. Well, detectives also found out that Burkhart used a cell phone that wasn't reported to law enforcement, and he was captured on camera at one of the New Orleans public libraries the same time that the comments on those photos were left. So he was trying to be sneaky and using the free Wi-Fi at the library to pursue his interest.
And he thought he was clever.
Yeah. Too bad he was captured on camera. Authorities also found out that Burkhart removed the stamp from his driver's license that identified him as a sex offender.
Oh.
And
Ho.
he applied for a job at Harrah's Casino.
What?
Yes. He was initially hired until a background check revealed his sex offender status, and the staff at Harrah's notified the police.
I don't know how he would thought he could
get away with that.
Get past the fingerprint process.
Because he's gotten away with so many other things, right? I mean, that's what we've talked about quite often on this podcast is how people escalate, right? They keep getting away with things, and then eventually one day they don't get away with it anymore.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully, anyway.
At the very least, for a job like the casino, you get fingerprinted as part.
Yeah, you get fingerprinted.
Of the background check. Well, at least for certain high-level jobs.
Right.
The casino, okay. They're probably not going to do a background, like a fingerprint background check just for someone who wants to be, let's say, a barback or a bartender or a server, restaurant worker, the casino.
But I'm assuming that because Burkhart's had a background in law enforcement, he was probably applying for something lofty like security or head of security or something like that.
Yes, and he didn't think the process was going to unfold like that.
Right. Now, he was rearrested later that July, and police found a phone with 67 images of teenage minors engaged in sex acts. And there were also images on the phone that showed partially dressed preteen boys that basically this all violated the conditions of a supervised release. All of these things, right? Like removing the sex offender stamp, not having a registered cell phone, not telling law enforcement about his persona under supervision, not even registering as a sex offender.
Yeah, and now sex offender registration, of course, is about providing a layer of security between the sex offender and those and society.
Right.
You see, so not his demonstrated non-compliance with that, of course, is evidence itself that he had no intention of honoring the agreement, and it is something he agreed to.
Right. And also, he made $10,000 bail by the following day, but then the federal parole authorities took him back into custody for violating the terms of his conditional release, and he was ordered held without bond until a February 2020 hearing over whether he should ever even be released. In 2021, it was ruled that Burkhart will be held indefinitely in a North Carolina federal facility. Now, at this time, Burkhart has not been publicly named as a suspect in the deaths of Daniel Dewey, Dennis Turcotte, or Raymond Richardson, but it is noteworthy that one of the detectives investigating those murders was the same detective that secured Burkhart's arrest warrant in 2019. And recent events have sparked renewed interest in the deaths, and the cold case squads in their respective jurisdictions are now also investigating those deaths. In addition to Windman and Groomer, the author of the 1982 Times-Picayune story has been contacted by authorities with questions about Burkhart, according to our current local news site, NOLA.com. Certain weird details in Burkhart's notebook never made it into the newspaper, but there was nothing in the scribblings that led the journalist to conclude that Burkhart was responsible for the deaths of anyone. So here's the thing, though. I think that if Burkhart had actually done those things, I think he was smart enough to get away with it.
Yes, unfortunately, law enforcement officers who commit crimes are sometimes smart enough to get away with them. Not always, though.
Not always, and we will talk about that again at some point, because here's the thing. Burkhart finally did slip up. Even if he'll never actually go to trial for the deaths of those boys, he very well could have had something to do with it. It's, in fact, I would venture that it's likely that he had something to do with it. Especially when you think about the fact that he was using one of the boys as pedophile bait. Right?
I mean, yes. Ironically, just like career criminals, police officers who habitually commit crimes were eventually caught as well.
Right.
You see, the lesson that they themselves fail to learn from those they pursue.
Right. Yes. So I really wish, though, that we would have answers as to what happened to those boys. This is one of those things. When I first started reading about it and looking into it, I was just blown away by the rabbit hole I kept going down, and I found out all this other stuff. I had never even heard of this Burkhart person until I started stumbling into information about it.
Well, I do have a faint memory of the report of his arrest from the news.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, law enforcement officers out there who may be contemplating committing crimes, you're subject to the same rules and laws as everyone else who pursues that lifestyle.
Right.
You yourself will eventually be caught as well.
Yes, so don't do it. Don't do crimes.
Yes, the old saying is very much true. Crime doesn't pay, and the wages of sin are death.
That's a very good point.
Yes.
Yeah, very good reminder. Of course, next week we're going to have a coffee talk episode. It's going to be a nice palate cleanser from this because, frankly, I think this is one of the worst people I've ever talked about on this podcast.
Yes, definitely. It's despicable. Anytime you have someone who is responsible for protecting and serving, violating not only that sacred oath, but violating the sacred trust of
the public at large,
of protecting the children.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is. I don't know what's more despicable, a serial killer, or someone who habitually violates the sacred trust of protecting the innocence of children.
How about we agree that they're both on the same rung of the ladder?
Yeah, they both deserve whatever they get. They both deserve whatever happens to them. And the only reason to give those kinds of people a fair trial is to make sure that the system is not rigged so that a political dissident can be framed as that type of person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in next week's Coffee Talk episode, we're going to take a look at a curious story that involves a bright strobing street light that's terrorized the neighborhood and a couple of rogue electricians who dealt with the problem. So we hope that you will join us next week. And until then, be safe, be kind. Remember that we're all human beings, and don't park next to vans.
If it's dark, it's unsafe, and you don't feel like it is safe, then don't be there in the first place. And if you're being interviewed by law enforcement and you are not a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime, lawyer up.